And we are recording. Right, good evening. This is the second in our third series of Big Jewish Ideas, and the subject is Shabbat. So it might not seem such a big idea. It's quite familiar, and it's obviously been borrowed. That they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and so the Shabbos concept, which certainly comes from the Torah, it's a Jewish concept, has very much been borrowed and adapted by others. I'm going to, as in previous sessions, teach this from a source sheet. And after my recent conversation with Zoom, I'm now confident I've solved this problem. So let's hope this all works nicely. And I'll get the text on the screen in just a moment. Here we go. We're getting there. Okay, we're getting there a bit slowly. Here we are. And here. Here we go. I hope you can see this text. And here goes. I want to get my spotlight out. Here we go. So the very obvious starting point for a conversation about what Shabbos is, what the real idea behind it is, the concept is obviously the creation story. The creation story devotes only 3 verses to the concept of Shabbos. If you're familiar with the structure of the creation story, it actually appears twice. There's a creation story, the seven days of creation, and then there's another creation story which is human focused, and only the first one contains reference to Shabbos. The second story with Adam and Eve in the garden and eating the fruit and sinning, being thrown out. This does not include the story of Shabbos. It appears in the early part of the Bible only here. So having completed the 6 days, and God sees that it's tov ma'od, it's very good, the 6 days are completed, what happens is as follows. Vaychulu hashomayim va'oretz v'chol tzva'om. The heaven and the earth and all their hosts, that means that all their multitudes were completed. So what happened then? Vaychal Elohim bayim hashavi'im malachto asher so. God completed on the 7th day his work that he had performed. And he rested, or better translation actually is ceased. Baishbois is a verb from which the word Shabbos appears, and he ceased on the 7th day from all of his activity that he had done. And God blessed the 7th day, and he sanctified it. Why? Because on it he ceased, desisted, from all of his work that God had performed to do, which is just the way the text ends. So this produces a couple of quite interesting observations which you may not have noticed. First of all, we're familiar with referring to the 6 days of creation, but actually God seems to be doing something on the 7th day. He completes. First, God completes on the 7th day the activities that he'd been doing. And only that, and on the 7th day, he desists. So the first thing is to say that Shabbos doesn't really mean resting. It means to cease or desist. So lishbois, the verb that produces the noun Shabbat or Shabbos, means to desist, to abstain in some sense. But first, before there can be abstention, the process must be finished. So although we tend to refer to the 6 days of creation, it would appear that God is actually doing something here on the 7th day. Once he's done it and he desists, then God blesses it because it was the day on which he desists, not because it was the day on which he completed the work, note, but on the day that he had desisted. So I'm just flagging these ideas for future consideration. Now, there are many references to Shabbos in the Torah, and we can't and don't need to look at all of them to build up a picture. But here, perhaps, is the next most well-known example, which I'm going to move to the center of the page, which appears in the middle of Shemos. And its location is actually quite significant, and we will come back to that as well. So you know these verses because they are said as part of the davening. They are selected as the introduction to Shabbos morning Kiddush. These are words with which I imagine you're familiar. V'shomru v'nei Shabbos, and children of Israel shall observe the Shabbos. La'asos es Shabbos adoresom v'risolom, to perform or to practice the Shabbos l'doresom throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant. Between me and between Bnei Israel, it is an eternal, everlasting sign. Why? Because in 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth. Ubayom hashavi'i, and on the 7th day, Shovas, that fits with the text we just saw above. Shovas, he ceased or desisted. Vayinofash. Now the word vayinofash, it's so familiar because you know the words, and some of you are probably saying the words along with me. They're so familiar that we may not pause to think what this word vayinofash means. So it's subject to quite some considerable disagreement and conversation. And I want to think about what this word means because it will be quite important. We have to observe Shabbos. Why? Because God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he did Shabbos. Because of Shovas, he rested, and we're going to observe Shabbos, lishbois, to do that activity, whatever it means. Vayinofash. Now it's translated here. This is how the text came off the disc. It's translated here as he was refreshed, and there are many other translations. So I'm going to ask you, what is the root of this word vayinofash? What Hebrew word does this suggest to you? And if you wish to speak, you will have to unmute yourself.
Nefesh.
Nefesh, that's correct. And what does nefesh mean?
Your soul.
A soul, that's correct, that's correct. There are several words in the Bible for soul, but nefesh is a soul. That's why I think the translation has it as refreshed, because it somehow or other kind of renewed it in some way. And it's quite difficult exactly to translate it into clear and precise English, but I'm not going to try to do that. I'm going to tell you what it means.
Hello, I've always thought of it as almost like a sigh, because sometimes, you know, they say when you let out a sigh, it's an expression of the soul. And it sort of seems like by the time Hashem finished, there was like almost a sigh of relief that he did so. That's always how I thought of that word.
So actually that explanation fits with the Gemara. And the Gemara says, Vai ovda nefesh, which is that the kind of woe to the soul, the Shabbos will come and it will go, and there's a sort of sigh of some sort. So that idea actually has some kind of background. It's certainly a more midrashic explanation. And I think it's valid as it appears in the early sources. I'm particularly interested in understanding why it uses the word nefesh there. There are other words that could be used for a sigh or to be refreshed. And I like Diana's suggestion that the root is nefesh, soul. I think the correct translation is imbued with a soul. What did he do on the 7th day? Shovas, he desisted. That means that the creative activities that were required to create the universe, to bring the universe into being, they were completed. They were ended. That means they were signed off. God signed off and recognized they were completed. And then he desisted from those activities. And once he desisted from activities, it was possible via Nofash to imbue that physical existence with spiritual meaning and purpose. So refreshed is not so far from the correct translation, but I would say imbued with spirituality. Because until now, you're talking about an entirely physical creation. And although the word malacha, which appeared early, we've seen it before, means a creative activity, God uses a certain set of creative activities, and we also are imbued with the ability to utilize those creative activities to change, manipulate, alter the world. And on Shabbos, as we're going to see shortly, one doesn't do that, and thereby, by desisting, imbues it with meaning or purpose. So this view, this translation, I think, is validated by the commentary called Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim is a Sephardi commentator of great significance who lived in the 18th century. He's buried in Har HaZeisim, and many years ago, I remember going to his grave. It's still extant. There's a little building over it on the Mount of Olives. And he offers an explanation which brings these two sources together. The correct way of understanding these verses is that this world requires some kind of spiritual flow to keep it in existence. God might create it, but it becomes dead material unless, from this mystical perspective, there is a constant influx of spirituality. And this is, as he said, and anthropomorphized. This is like a human being needs to eat and drink to stay alive. You can't just, once you exist, you can't continue to exist unless you feed the body. These are all acquired through physical activity, which are mundane. And when God wanted to sanctify, what does it mean to sanctify the seventh day? Before he created the seventh day, as it were, he blessed it that it would lack nothing, even though in the lower physical world, if you don't act, if you don't perform, you don't engage with the world, then you don't have anything. There's no food, there's no productivity. You can only succeed by mundane activity. Even so, God blessed it. And he goes on to explain. I'm not going to read the rest of it, and he explains that it's not only that, it's quite counterintuitive. On the day when you do the least effort and therefore should have the least, you have the most. The special clothes, there's the kind of sense of disengagement from the world, and special meals. But Lamarsha Pirush B'Zohar, and he quotes the Zohar, the classic of Jewish mysticism. That in the sixth, the Shabbos draws down divine flow into all 6 days of creation. And that's what it means to say, Vayavorech, that God blesses it. Because through this, God instructed the blessing, which would give life to the world. Now, this is written in a kind of mystical language, and it's not so accessible. But I believe what he's saying is that what Shabbos does is imbue the 6 physical days, the days of creative activity, the days of yagir, of effort, toil. It imbues it with some kind of higher purpose, meaning, and almost a justification. And this is a reading of this. That idea is an explanation. On the 7th day, Shabbos, he rested, and by desisting from creative activity, he then breathe spirituality into it, something which is replicated each week in the Shabbos experience. We have to keep Shabbos. Why? Key. The key word here is key, because, meaning, do you know why we have to observe Shabbos? Because God observes Shabbos. Our Shabbos somehow replicates that experience, and we will elaborate on that idea as we continue. So just to remind you that if you look at the 2 presentations of the Aseres HaDibros, the Revelation, the 10 Commandments, you will recall that the 4th of the 10 Commandments is Shabbos, and it appears in 2 different guises. And the 2 texts are more different than any of the other differences that distinguish the 2 presentations, one in the middle of Shemos, the other near the beginning of Devarim. Here's the first. This is the 4th commandment in the first presentation of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it. For 6 days shall you work. It doesn't mean physical work, but it means be creative and engage with the physical world and perform all of your activities. The 7th day is the Shabbos of the Lord your God. And what does that mean? You should do no malacha, creative activity. This is a list of all the people, you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, your animal, and the stranger who is in your gate. Why? Because in 6 days, God made heaven and earth. It's the same as the text above, although, of course, that text actually appears 11 chapters later. Es hayom v'es kol hashebom, the seas and everything in them. Vayonach bayom hashvi'i, and he left off on the 7th day. Al kain, therefore, be'erach Hashem es yom hashabos v'yikadasheu. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. So this is familiar. And if you look here At the second presentation in Devarim 5, it's quite different. Shomar, observe, even the first word is different. Es Yom HaShabbos l'kadashoi, the Sabbath day to sanctify it. As the Lord your God has commanded you. This is all the same. For 6 days shall you work and perform all your activity. On the seventh day, it's a Shabbat to the Lord your God. It's a slightly different list. Your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, your ox, your donkey, and all your animals, and the stranger in your gate. Leman, your nuach avducho v'amoscho kamoicho, so that your servant and your maidservant should leave off work, should rest like you. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and therefore you were mistreated. You need to learn to treat people well. You need to give them time off. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commanded you to perform the Sabbath day. Now you'll see that it's a completely different text. In the first version, the reason provided for Shabbos is to recall creation. And in the second version, the reason is to recall the Exodus with no mention of the creation. And you will see that tension in many of the Shabbos prayers, which make references varially to remembering creation and to remembering the Exodus. Because, of course, as you can see, it seems to recall both. So with all that in mind, what we've got so far is that the Shabbos has, the word Shabbos means to desist, to rest, but more specifically, it's to stop doing something, to leave off from something, to desist. And as a result of God desisting on the seventh day, having completed or signed off from creation, we have to do the same thing. It's a day that's blessed. We've seen that it somehow is imbued with spirituality at the beginning of time, and that cycle of 6 creative days, followed by breathing meaning into the 6 days, because one can create and do and grow. And those physical activities can be developmental without having any real meaning. One can end up just doing for the sake of doing. And Shabbos is intended to give it purpose, some kind of, the way the Maharal would put it, the Maharal writing in Prague at the end of the 16th century, he would say that our world is characterized by the number 6. The number 6, because there are 3 dimensions. If you draw X, Y, Z axes, occasionally I remember that I used to be a mathematician, then you have 6 components. You have the positive and negative components of each of the 3 axes, effectively 6 sides of a cube. But that simply describes the physical dimensions. You can give, as it were, a very accurate specification to an engineer, and they will build your item to precisely that specification in 3 dimensions with all the working parts, and not have the slightest idea what it is, what it's for, what its potential, what its strengths and what its weaknesses are. You also need some kind of overview, some kind of definition as to what the item is. That for the Maharal is the 7th dimension. That's what Shabbos does. It provides a dimension of meaning to the 6 physically creative days. But with all that, there is a big piece missing. There is something missing that links Shabbos to creation and to another structure, which we now need to investigate. So if you ask any child with a modicum of Jewish education, how do you know what you are and are not allowed to do on Shabbos? There's a huge list of things you can't do on Shabbos. 39 categories of forbidden creative activities. These are activities which are ways in which human beings take the resources of the world, they manipulate, change them, alter them, and the extent of their creativity, the extent to which these alterations are permanent, determine whether these are forbidden activities. But how do you know which are the categories of creative activities? Because there's a thing called the Mishkan, Mishkan being the portable tabernacle sanctuary that was built in the desert, and all the 39 categories of activities that were required to make this Mishkan, they're the things you can't do on Shabbos. Very nice. Until you begin to think about what's the relationship between the two. Before we get to understand that relationship, which is critical to understanding the whole endeavor of Shabbos before we take it back to creation, before we get there, we have to understand why it is that the rabbis linked Shabbos to the Mishkan. And actually, it's a very simple answer, because the Torah does. Because in numerous places, the creation of the Mishkan, which was viewed as an essential idea. What's the Mishkan about? The Mishkan is creating a portable home for God. We're going to see in a moment whether that was ever an ideal or it was a concession to human weakness that manifests itself after the golden calf. That's a disagreement. But it's a house for God. It is a precursor to the temple that will be built in Jerusalem. And there seems to be a great urgency to build this Mishkan. If you follow the Ramban Nachmanides, he will say that they were so inspired by the Sinaitic revelation, they needed some vehicle to capture and maintain the inspiration. They felt a great urgency to build this Mishkan. So much great Mishkan, so much urgency, but it requires all these creative activities. There's wood, and there's dyeing, and there's weaving, and there's 100 activities that need to go, or more specifically, 39 activities that need to go into it. And this great urgency and what's permitted to do is conveyed by the verses and ameliorated by the juxtaposition in the text between the Mishkan and Shabbos, which appears in many places. Here you go. And in Shabbos 31, we actually saw an early exit. The section of the Shomru, the second source, is actually from the same chapter a bit later on. See, I have appointed by name Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur of the tribe of Yehuda. I've endowed him with the Spirit of God, the Chochmah, with wisdom, the Sunnah, and understanding, the Das, and and in every type of artisanal work. And I missed out a little bit because then it lists all the types of activities that will be required. Directly afterwards. And that Vov, which I'm going to highlight, it might actually allow me to. Right. This Vov here is very, very important. No problem. I'm going to leave the dot there. Normally translated as and, but Vov very often means but. But I told to Darbel Ben Ezel, you should speak to the children of Israel, Lemo, and say to them, however, a Shabbos Tishmori, you must observe my Sabbaths. For it's a sign between me and between you throughout your generations to know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you, or consecrates you. So you can see, if this text is read sensitively, what it is saying. There's this tremendous desire to build this house of God, but hold on a minute. But remember, you must keep Shabbos, meaning build the temple, build your sanctuary, but you have to keep Shabbos, which effectively says Shabbos overrides the sanctuary. But it's only meaningful if the activities that were required to build a Mishkan, that the activities that are forbidden on Shabbos are those that are required to build a Mishkan, otherwise you could do both. So you can see from the sensitive reading of the text, the juxtaposition is critical. It says however, you can see it saying, build the Mishkan, but there's an exception. You must observe Shabbos, so you can see straight away that what you need to do the Mishkan is what you can't do on Shabbos. And another example, this example, by the way, the one we're reading, certainly appears in the text before the golden calf, just before, actually, it's the next chapter. And this one appears afterwards in the building phase. This is very near the end of Shemos. We're 3 chapters later. By Akel Moshe, this is the opening sequence of the parsha of Vayakel, which is the penultimate parsha of Shemos. And Moshe gathered his kol b'nei Yisrael, or the congregation of Bnei Yisrael, and said to them, Eila hadavorim, these are the things asher tzivah Hashem la'asos that God has commanded to do them. Shesis yobim te'el se'em malocha. For 6 days you may do work. The 7th day shall be for you a holy Shabbat, Shabboson la'Hashem, a special Sabbath for God. Kol ha'seva malocha yumos. Anyone who does malocha v'inakti shall die. Lo savaru eish b'chol moshvei seichem yom Shabbos. This is an example. You should not burn fire, of course, which in early times was perhaps it's a very obvious choice because it was the formative activity, the kind of process that enabled human beings to control their environment. Do not burn fire in all of your habitation beyond Shabbos. And guess what? Next verse. Moshe said to the whole community of Bnei Yisrael as follows: this is the thing that God has commanded you. terumo. Straight away, take from yourselves the offering to God. Everyone whose heart motivates him shall bring, etc., the offering to God, gold, silver, and copper. And that's the beginning of a long passage detailing the offerings and the eventual construction of the Mishkan. Again, this juxtaposition. Observe Shabbos, and when you've observed Shabbos, you can build the Mishkan. And so this juxtaposition, which the rabbis detect, you do not to be a sophisticated reader to see that the Torah, and these are not the only two places, repeatedly juxtaposes the two, and we can see at a halachic level why therefore it is that the rabbis understand there is some intimate relationship between Mishkan and Shabbos. That's very nice. And at a technical level, I think we can even understand it. Build a Mishkan, but keep Shabbos. So what you can't do on Shabbos is what you need to build a Mishkan. And that, in terms of my early Jewish education, is where it sat. And there was something uneasy about that because it didn't explain. It didn't explain why. It just seems to be, there's nothing to do with each other. What's the connection? There must be a very sophisticated idea that certainly eluded me when I was a child and quite possibly eluded my teachers as well. Actually, it's not so complicated. And it's an idea which is relatively easy to uncover. And in it lies the key to the relationship between Shabbos and Mishkan, and will lead us back to creation and the ultimate function of Shabbos. So here, I touched on this earlier. I mentioned that there is a discussion as to whether the building of the Mishkan was intended as an ideal or a concession. According to Rashi, and you'll see the Sforno, the great Italian commentator writing in the 16th century, the Mishkan was never intended to exist. All there would be a simple altar, as described after the passage of the Revelation, and people would gather around it. They didn't need a building. Look at this. Here, this is just after the passage of the Revelation, at the end of the 20th passage, chapter of Shabbos. Mizbach Adomor Taseli, make for me an altar of earth, and offer upon it your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, your flock and your cattle. Because in every place where I will cause my name to be mentioned, any place, as it were, I pop up, says God, I will come to you and bless you. You don't need a special building, just a simple altar will do. Says the Sforno here, the gun came. It's in the middle of the sentence. I didn't want to bring too much text. You don't need to build sanctuaries of silver and gold and precious stones in order to draw close to me, or that I shall draw close to you. A simple mizbach adomor, a simple altar. So according to the Sforno, saying explicitly here and elsewhere, and Rashi says it too, there was never going to be a Mishkan. When they sinned and they could see that they were drawn to physical objects, the way in which this problem was resolved was to create a new outlet, a new direction for their desire to be close to God, but in an authorized, sanctified way, hence the construction of the Mishkan. With that in mind, I'm going to show you a passage I think we'll read mostly in English. This is an excerpt from the Midrash Tanchuma in Pekudei, very near the end of Shabbos. The Midrash Tanchuma is a very early, very authoritative midrashic gloss on the text. And it offers a marvelous idea, which is elaborated in the subsequent text, one example of which, or two, we'll see on the final page of text which follow. Now, I'll just read a line in Hebrew, and I'm going to read it in English. Mishkan. These are the accounts of the Mishkan. That's how the last parsha of Shemos begins. This is a classic. The rabbi giving this drosha would have then cited another verse, usually from one of the wisdom texts, from Tehillim or Mishlei, Psalms or Proverbs, and somehow intertwine them. Hashem or Havti ma'oin beisecho. The Lord, I have loved the habitation of your house. What is this? This is the Heichal, the sanctuary that somehow aligns or corresponds to the place of the dwelling of your glory. And now I'm carrying on in the English. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, this verse indicates that the earthly temple is directly opposite the heavenly temple, as it is said, the place, O Lord, which you have made for you to dwell in, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. That's in the Song of the Sea. Rabbi Jacob, son of Desist, said, why does it say, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells? Because the tabernacle is equal to the creation of the world itself. And how is that so? And now this Midrash embarked on an extraordinarily long text, which I've culled massively, just to give you a taste of it. It goes into a very detailed account. How is it that the Mishkan corresponds to creation? And of course, we're interested in the concept, but here are the details first. On the first day, it says in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and it's written elsewhere, who stretched out the heavens like a curtain, right? That's a description, a poetic description in Psalms of the creative processes at the beginning of time. Concerning the tabernacle, it's written, you shall make curtains of goat's hair. About the second day of creation, it states, let there be a firmament to divide between them. Let it divide the waters and waters of the tabernacle. It's written, the veil shall divide you, i.e. there is a correlation that if you know how to read the story of the Mishkan, every detail parallels some aspect of creation. I cut out days 3 to 6 because it would take another 2 pages. On the 7th day, the heaven and earth were finished. And with regard to the tabernacle, it's written, and in the Hebrew, the language is extremely similar. Thus was completed all the work of the tabernacle. Concerning the creation of the world, it is written, and God blessed. And of the tabernacle, it said, and Moses blessed them. With regard to creation, it says, and God finished them. The tabernacle is written on the day Moses made an end. Of creation, it says, and hallowed it. And of the tabernacle, he had anointed and sanctified it. Why is the tabernacle equal to heaven and earth? Because even as heaven and earth bear witness concerning Israel, as it is written, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, near the end of Devarim. So the tabernacle bears witness in behalf of Israel, as it is said, these are the counts of the tabernacle of the testimony. So I'm going to unpack this text in just a moment, but I want first to read our penultimate text, which is Rabbeinu Bachya, one of the great Sfaradi mystical commentary from the school of the Ramban. And the Rabbeinu Bachya first quotes this midrash, and he adds a little bit to it. Everything that the rabbis mentioned in this midrash, the one we've just read, about the correlation or correspondence between the Mishkan and the universe, they're talking about generalities. And there are innumerable details that come from this principle, meaning this is a general and completely true principle, and you will find that every detail corresponds. And he makes a very bold claim that pretty much every detail, if you look closely enough, pretty much every detail of the Mishkan will find its correspondence, and he gives some other examples. Now, I think this needs a little bit of unpacking. It is partly a mystical idea, but partially, I think, a non-mystical idea. What the Midrash and the Rabbeinu Bachya and many other commentators who adopt this line of thinking are saying is that the Mishkan is a universe in microcosm, that human beings are being called upon, as it were, to create a world, to build a world. And in case you don't understand that that's what it is, there are numerous details for the textually sensitive, which will make the reader understand that this Mishkan is intended to parallel the creation of the world. Human beings make a Mishkan in microcosm. God made the universe the macrocosm, and every detail follows. And we need just one more detail, and then I'll be able to tie the ends together. So here I'm introducing you to one of my favorite commentators. You may not have heard of him. This is Rav Avram Sabah, who was a Portuguese refugee who left the Iberian Peninsula in the expulsion, as you know, perhaps a few years after the expulsion from Spain. The Jews were expelled from Portugal, and he fled from Portugal. Extraordinarily, he lost many of his manuscripts. A lot of it he recreated, and his Torah commentary is called Sror HaMorah, the Bundle of Myrrh, which is the title of which is drawn from Shir Shir in the book of the Song of Songs. The Sror HaMorah says the follows, Rabbi Avram Sabah. We know he's creating the detail of the creation of the Mishkan is hinted to, or hints to, an aspect of the creation story. This we know already. This is a midrash. Avram Sabah did not make this up. Nirmo's key. What's really lying? And here he ties the themes together. Nirmo's ki lafisha b'chet Adam Rishon b'chet Egel. It gives the two classic sins of human history: the sin of Adam in the garden, and the sin of the golden calf. These made the entire works of creation wobbly. He weakened them. It is as though the entire, world was wobbling. What he seems to be saying is that human beings are entrusted with a world in which they are supposed to see God, bring God, create spirituality and meaning for the whole of humanity. And instead, they sin, they turn away from God, they prevent God from entering the world, they undermine the very purpose of existence. They call into question the whole project of creation. But God forgives them. God wants to create a new world. And to strengthen it and to establish it on firm foundations, but using the Mishkan. And of course, the lesson that appears through all these sources is that when human beings are given something on a plate, they tend to ruin it. It's what the rabbinic sources call a Nahamaduka Sufa, the kind of bread of shame, meaning that you don't really value something that you haven't worked for. You feel ashamed to receive the reward. Instead, God gives an opportunity. You've ruined the world, you rebuild it. That we saw in the Midrash. Why have I loved the habitation of your house? Why? Because it corresponds to the creation of your world. And here is just explaining the Midrash. Because the matters of the Mishkan gave strength, enabled the matters of the world, as it were, to continue to be re-established. And that is why it says when it comes to the Mishkan, you must say at the entrance of the Mishkan, the dedication ceremony for 7 days, as it were, to establish, to firmly establish the works, days of creation. That is why every detail of the creation story has a parallel in the construction of the Mishkan. So I think what we've come to is as follows, is that there is now a three-way correspondence. We have easily in the past understood the relationship between Shabbos and the creation story. Human beings are endowed with creative powers. Those creative powers are the same creative powers that God used to make the universe, although they are, of course, in a much smaller measure. And we desist from those activities as somehow paralleling creation. That isn't sufficient. How do you know exactly what type of activities? Well, God asked human beings to rectify their error, that when they had sinned, to make a Mishkan, following the view of Rashi and the Sforno, that there would not have been a Mishkan had human beings not sinned. Their sin undermined the very foundation and purpose of creation. And God says to them, only you can rectify this now. I will endow you with the creative powers to replicate what I did when I built the universe. And you will go ahead and create this building, a universe in microcosm. And when you do it the right way, I will fill this space. It will be an example, as it were, a universe in microcosm, a place where God sits in his divine presence, which will ultimately fill the whole universe once again. You are tasked with recreating the world, and you must parallel my activities in doing it. And as such, we can understand that human beings are able to repair the world every week by replicating, emulating the divine. And if you want to get a proper understanding of the phrase Tselem Elokim, that man is created in the shadow of God, as it says in the creation story, this means, first of all, that man is able to shadow God. This ties us a little bit to what we said last week, that how somehow shadow God, i.e. when he acts, we act. That's the idea. We have certain powers that reflect his powers, but also we're able to shadow God's creative power, because when the moment comes, we can rebuild the very universe that we have destroyed, the one he created. And that helps us to understand now a much more sophisticated dimension of the relationship between the Mishkan and Shabbos. Shabbos and Mishkan are intimately connected. Desisting from certain activities doesn't just, as it were, emulate the creation process, but what it does is recognize that we are capable of creation ourselves, of changing, reworking, and rediscovering the world. And so what this means is that there are, I suppose, new ways of looking at Shabbos. Shovas v'nofash means that Shabbos, when human beings desist from that creative activity, do not just attribute once more the creative capacities to God, but we demonstrate by so doing that we are partners with God in creating, rebuilding, and constantly reformulating the world. It places enormous responsibility on us. It means that not only are we capable of replicating the divine, meaning that God has invested enormous confidence in us, but it also means that we have a lot of responsibility for using those creative and destructive powers very responsibly, because they can be enormously beneficial or they can be enormously destructive. You can build devices and vaccines that save thousands or millions of lives, and you can build destructive forces that unleash disastrous consequences on humanity and the rest of the universe. And so those creative powers are an enormous gift. And understanding, if you like, the moment in history where God expected us and demanded of us that we use them responsibly, the place of the Mishkan, shows exactly who we are and what we can do, but also I think now creates a proper understanding of the relation between Shabbos, creation, and Mishkan. And so I've moved from what I hope is a rather simplistic, childish understanding of the relationship between Mishkan, why can't you do the 39 activities because you couldn't do them in Mishkan and that's it, to realizing that there is a very powerful, sophisticated correlation in which God is investing the most extraordinary powers of human beings, which we need to learn to use properly, and when the moment comes, not to use properly. That is it. So if you have any questions, this is your moment. I did promise it'd be about 45 minutes, and it's been exactly 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I think there's something about also the creative power of building relationships, because Hashem built the world for us. We build the Mishkan to house him. So there's almost like, it's not just a parallel, but there's a reciprocity as well in the creative relationship. We're not just paralleling his creative powers, but we're using it to build the relationship.
I think that's right. In a longer share, I think in a longer share, what one adds to this is that there is a successive, if you like, retraction of the divine presence, that God, man experiences God directly in the Garden of Eden, and each successive generation drives the divine presence away. The way the Midrash casts, there are 7 levels, and eventually, by the time we get down to Egypt, the divine presence is up there in the clouds. As far away could it possibly be? And then a process gradually begins of restoring it to earth, and therefore kind of the idea of kind of rebuilding the relationship with God, creating a collective space, bearing in mind that the initial instruction to build the Mishkan says, "Osuli mikdash, make for me a sanctuary, v'shochanti b'sochom, and I will dwell not in it, but in them." Remember, that's ultimately the purpose.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi. Yes.
Oh, hello.
Hello. Actually made it. Something that always sort of captured my imagination when we were sort of going through the concept of Shabbat and Sam was the sort of like the mystical sort of discussions around the discussion of the mystics around sort of time dimension of Shabbat, and whether it was discussions around whether it is the day itself. So, you know, the Shabbat, if you were in the middle of like the rainforest in South America, you know,
whatever's left of it.
Sort of know it's Shabbat. Do you know that discussion I'm talking about? Is Shabbat something in and of itself, and is in the time and the place, or is it just a concept which allows us to have the sort of wonderful Jewish life we have?
Yeah. The name is referring to there's a Gemara in which it considers what would happen if you kind of woke up on a desert island, or in your case in the rainforest, after a knock on the head, and you didn't know what day of the week it was. How would you decide what to do vis-a-vis Shabbos? And what underlies that discussion is Shabbos an objective reality? Yeah. And therefore, there's no purpose in keeping Shabbos on a Tuesday. There's no point. You don't happen to know which day of the week is Saturday, so you have to decide what to do. Or is it really something which is subjective? And as long as every 7 days you keep a Shabbos, the process is. And what's the answer, Naomi?
I just remember it being a good discussion.
It is a good discussion. There isn't really an answer, but that halachic discussion is really an exploration, as you say, about whether it's something which is subjective or object, some kind of independent mystical reality, or simply part of a rhythm that one requires to be someone who has a sort of meaningful life. And I think that no one can quite decide between the two.
Well, I guess my question is, where does the concept of the mystical, sort of almost like there is a spirit of Shabbat that exists regardless. Where does that come from? What's the origin of it?
Well, there's a kind of children's story which is really a paraphrase of a Gemara as well, which is that some cynic comes along. There's usually a Roman asking questions. They're always written in the Roman times. A Roman asking some great rabbi about your Shabbos, and so he invites him around for a meal, and they have the great food. He goes, "This is not a problem. This is just about the food and the circumstance." So he gets himself got a nice robe, and he finds out how to make cholent, and he puts it on the Wednesday. It doesn't taste right, and of course they say, "Well, the problem is it's missing Shabbos." So that's obviously trying to teach the idea there's something intrinsic about Shabbos, and if you don't do it on Shabbos, it doesn't work. You can't do Shabbos on Tuesday. That's the message. On the other hand, the concepts might work, and I think that the sources point to the idea that there is something specific and existential about the seventh day, which is started from a cycle, and every seventh day is like that, and therefore there is something which you can tune into, which just doesn't exist. You can't tune into a TV program, that is not being broadcast at the moment. You just can't watch it. That's when it's on, and you have to watch it when it's on. Okay, because you can record it and watch it afterwards. It's not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea. If it's not around, you can't watch it. So I think sources do lean to the idea there's something intrinsic. There is a mystical reality which describes Shabbos, and there is a sort of in another class, you go on to talk about Olam Haba, about how somehow it replicates the post-life experience, and everything has to be ready, and what you have on Shabbos is only exactly what was ready before, which replicates what happens when one leaves this world and goes to another world, except after the Shabbos you come back again. That's the concept of the Basum and the spices at the end of Shabbos. So I think there's a lot of stuff around that which can't be packed into a 45-minute kind of philosophy share about Shabbos. Yes, but I agree there's a lot to explore, and I think probably on balance one would probably go for there's something a kind of a mystical reality about it, because the halacha actually is, in that case, is that you have to do the minimum malacha on every single day, because it could be that your day is Shabbos, which means it does appear to make sure you important to the halacha and you get the right day. But since if you did no malacha ever, you'd die because you wouldn't have any food. You just have to do the minimum to keep alive until you find out what day it is.
Right. Okay.
But I know people who do that anyway. So any more questions?
Thank you.
Ruth, you want to ask a question? You have to unmute yourself. Oh, you're having some difficulty. Let's see if I can do it. Yes. Oh, it's not working. You went on mute again. Hold on. Wait. Oh no. Oh dear, I deleted her by mistake. Are you there, Ruth? Sorry. I'm not quite sure what's happened. We can't hear you.
Oh, the host has stopped me.
No, sorry.
Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Can you hear my voice?
I did not. I
Don't
can hear
worry.
your voice. I did not intend to excise you. It was an accident.
I want to ask something a little bit outside your very interesting shiur. I've always been fascinated by the idea of 6 days a week and the seventh day is Shabbat. Was there any people in the world who had a Shabbat in their calendar before the Jews? I've looked.
I don't know.
I've tried, not very thoroughly, but I haven't found one.
I do not think so. I did want to hope this, you're calling this big Jewish ideas, that I actually was talking about a Jewish idea rather than some other idea. I'm not aware of it, but I really don't know the answer.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating.
I don't want to give an incompetent answer.
Right. I just think it's fascinating that we have this day of rest to renew ourselves, to renew our spirituality with God. It's so brilliant.
Yes.
So life enhancing.
I agree.
Okay, that's all I can say.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent place to end. I don't want to overrun. I said 45 minutes, we're a little bit over that. So thank you very much for joining me. and for your
Thank you, Rabbi.
questions. And the final installation of this
Very
third
good.
series of Big Jewish Ideas is next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, and the subject is tzedakah. And I've already written the class. I had a moment of inspiration last night.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Very good.
Good
Good
night.
evening.
Good night. Bye bye. Bye bye.